of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
The president has not set a deadline himself. Ultimately, he will dictate the timetable. And again, he is satisfied with the naval blockade, and he understands that Iran is in a very weak position, and the cards are in President Trump's hands right now.
Tonight, Strait standoff. Iranian forces test a U.S. blockade in the Strait of Hormuz as an extended ceasefire hangs in the balance. On Capitol Hill, members of Trump's cabinet facing lawmakers as the administration defends its strategy.
And speaking of Capitol Hill, from the federal budget to war powers, Congress is taking center stage. Democratic Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota and Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas will join us live from the Hill this hour.
Plus, Tesla tops targets. The electric vehicle maker's first quarter earnings beating expectations, pointing to steady profitability. Bloomberg Tech's co-host Ed Ludlow is standing by to break down the results. Watch the shares after hours.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. We kick off our coverage tonight with the deadlock between the U.S. and Iran, stuck in a battle over control of the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian forces targeting multiple commercial vessels in the waterway earlier today as the U.S. military continues its blockade, even after President Trump's indefinite ceasefire extension, while Washington is awaiting a new peace proposal from Tehran. Let's get the latest now from Bloomberg's Jeff Mason, who joins us live from the White House North Lawn. So, Jeff, I don't know if it really counts as a ceasefire with the kind of activity we are seeing in the Strait of Hormuz. Is there any indication that Iran is on the same page as President Trump is at this point?
A fair question there, Kaylee, and hard to say whether they're on the same page. Certainly they're not on the same page in terms of offering the peace proposal or a unified peace proposal that the president is asking for, and is what he said when he said in his Truth Social post yesterday that he was planning to and has extended that ceasefire. The White House is saying it's waiting on Iran. Caroline Leavitt, his press secretary, referred to that a little bit today. Take a listen.
The president chose to extend the ceasefire because it's Iran who needs to get their act together. The United States and President Trump have been very clear in our demands and our red lines and what we need to see in the best interest of the American people and our country and our allies from the very beginning.
So it's a little bit of a waiting game, but the president is waiting for what may or may not be a response from Iran about many of the things that he has said he wants in a peace agreement. But meanwhile, he is not, despite the skirmishes over the Strait of Hormuz, which are major, he has not directed the U.S. military to continue or restart, rather, its attacks.
Well, Jeff, as the administration tries to find its way through war and peace in the Middle East, it is turning to cannabis here, apparently. And remarkable bit of reporting from Bloomberg today. The Department of Justice is expected to, on the president's command, and he's done this some weeks ago now by executive order, reclassify cannabis as a lesser damaging drug. Is this something that could happen tonight?
Joe, I have to tell you, I'm impressed with that transition that you just did. And
see how
yes,
I tried that.
It's certainly also one of President Trump's priorities, and he referenced that even over the weekend as he was in the Oval Office and signing a new executive order. Yeah, this could be coming soon, and it is honestly something that both this president and the previous administration were working towards, and it is a reflection of a shift in society and a shift in the United States about marijuana, although it does not, or it would not, all of a sudden make marijuana legal in all 50 states of this country, but it would make it easier for research, and it would make it easier for companies that do deal in marijuana to face a lower tax burden.
Yeah, it was a promise on the campaign trail. Jeff, thank you, as always. Bloomberg's Jeff Mason reporting live from the White House with us here on Balance of Power. And joining us now with her reaction to all of today's news, live from Capitol Hill, Democratic Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota, who serves on the Senate Banking, Finance, and Agriculture Committees. Senator, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It looks like timelines are going out the window here when it comes to Iran. White House says it's not 3 to 5 days, that there is no definite timeline. And the Washington Post is reporting that, in fact, it would take some 6 months to clear the Strait of Hormuz. We've got $4 a gallon gas still nationally. How long can people in your state put up with this if it's months and not weeks?
Well, this is creating massive economic uncertainty in my state. On Friday of last week, I was in western Minnesota talking to farmers, and they were telling me about the extreme economic challenges that they face. Just take the price of fertilizer, which has been surging, and many of them are looking to find the cash to buy fertilizer that is 30–40% more than it was, at Christmas time, and struggling to find the money. Not to mention the ongoing disruptions to the ag sector because of Trump tariffs. So it's a big problem. And then you layer on top of that the rising cost of diesel, which has a huge impact on production farming, not to mention folks that are just trying to drive their kids back and forth to school. So this is, I think, one of the reasons why this war is so deeply unpopular in Minnesota and around the country.
Well, when we consider those economic ramifications, Senator, so many of them centered on the notion that the Strait of Hormuz is not open for free transit. Would you be supportive of the U.S. Navy not only maintaining its blockade in order to punish Iran economically, but to get more actively involved in trying to make sure that the Strait is free and clear?
Well, so look, the Strait of Hormuz is closed because Iran has closed it. But we need to understand that when Donald Trump started this reckless and very poorly conceived war, he seemed to have no conception that the most likely thing that Iran was going to do was to use the leverage that they have to close the Straits of Hormuz. And now, as I understand it, there are mines throughout the strait. It's actually quite narrow, and it will take a long time to be able to freely open it to shipping and the major global artery for the economy that this is across the world. So this was a reckless thing to do to begin with, and now we have to try to figure out how to get out of it. And obviously, to me, the first job that we have is to figure out how to get the straits open. But Iran is not going to do that unless they have a larger agreement on resolving what's happening with this war. So that's the challenge that we face. And meanwhile, Americans are paying the price.
Does the Agriculture Committee have a plan in the works here to deal with fertilizer specifically? We know prices are up between 30 and 50% since late February. We're going into 2 months of this war, Senator. If waiting for the administration is the answer to farmers, that might leave them wanting for some time. Is there anything that the committee can do to bring relief?
Well, I mean, that's such a great point, because farmers are they're putting seed in the ground right now in Minnesota in a very, very uncertain time. So could the Agriculture Committee in both the House and the Senate, come up with some sort of an aid package to help farmers make it through? Yeah. I mean, conceivably, potentially. But of course, we're still talking about
Could reconciliation be a vehicle for that, Senator?
I don't think that that's a path forward, to tell you the truth, because mostly on the Republican side, they have such, I won't vote for that reconciliation package. They have such dramatic disagreements on their side. It's hard to imagine that that could fit in as well.
Well, when we consider the Republican reconciliation package, Senator, obviously it would be an aim to fund ICE and CBP for 3.5 years. Republicans would be able to do this on a partisan basis. Therefore, Democrats are not going to get many of the reforms to ICE and CBP that were sought in the aftermath of the events in your state and the death by shooting of those federal officers of 2 American citizens. Is it enough for your constituents in Minnesota that Democrats tried here, or is this actually potentially an area in which Democratic efforts to do this ultimately backfired?
No, I think that what was really important to my constituents is that they saw us fighting to get basic common sense guardrails on how these reckless and lawless federal agents were behaving. And, we might not be in power in Washington, but people expect to see us using our power to fight for them. And honestly, it is on the Republicans who refuse to even agree to basic common sense reforms that their local police departments have to abide by. And at the end of the day, here in the Senate, in a bipartisan way, I think the last time unanimously we voted and passed legislation to fully fund the Department of Homeland Security, except for ICE and Customs and Border Patrol. And so here we are now in this sort of ridiculous situation, and I just want to see those, that's why I voted to make sure that the Coast Guard and FEMA and the rest of the Department of Homeland Security that is providing important services to Americans, that those folks get paid while we continue to have this major disagreement about how ICE is operating in this country.
What about the new leader of DHS, Senator, your former colleague in the upper chamber, Markwayne Mullin? There was hope that this might create an opening for a conversation. The fact is, though, if reconciliation goes through and the funding bills that have been set up in sequence by Republicans, DHS and ICE will be fully funded for some time. Yet the reforms that you demanded are not there. Body cameras, yes. Warrants and demasking have not been addressed. Have you had a conversation with your former Senate colleague about this as someone who represents the state that really got this into the public sphere?
Well, as Senator Mullin was moving towards what it looked like going to be his nomination and ultimate confirmation, he indicated an openness to me to see whether we could find some common ground. And I mean, I continue to think that this is a place where Americans have found common ground. This is something that Americans want to see, and that outside of Washington, D.C., this isn't nearly as partisan as it is right here. And then, meanwhile, what are we about to do potentially tonight or tomorrow night? We're about to hand over tens and tens of billions of dollars to Customs and Border Patrol and ICE. They are already better funded than the Marines. And it's essentially a giant slush fund for them to have full funding for now upwards of 3 years without any accountability at all. And I think there's going to be a political price to pay for that. I do not think that this is what certainly it's not what people in Minnesota want to see when they are struggling to pay their doctor's bills and buy gas because of the rising costs of everything in this country.
And Senator, finally, you, of course, are on the Banking Committee, which had the opportunity to question President Trump's nominee to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve, Kevin Warsh, yesterday. His confirmation hearing may not lead quickly to a confirmation vote, however, given the protest of your Republican colleague Tom Tillis of North Carolina over the investigation into Chairman Powell, the criminal probe. He has suggested that perhaps the committee take over investigating any cost overruns at the Federal Reserve building to put the criminal probe aside. Would you be supportive of that notion, Senator, if it means that the DOJ is no longer going after Chairman Powell?
I mean, I believe that the DOJ should drop this ridiculous criminal investigation of the chair of the Fed, and the president should also stop picking on Lisa Cook, who's another governor of the Fed. And I've seen no evidence that there is any
route a potential off-ramp here.
I mean, that's really going to be up to the Republicans to figure out how they want to handle it. I have seen no evidence that there was any kind of criminal wrongdoing here. And so I, of course, won't support a criminal investigation moving from one venue to the next. And I respect Senator Tillis for standing up, because essentially what this is about is protecting the independence of the Fed. It is about making sure that the Fed is there to make decisions about monetary policy without being bullied by the president, who seems to be picking people that he believes should be in that role because they're going to do what he wants them to do. And of course, that's bad for markets, that's bad for market stability, and it's bad for the integrity of the institution.
All right, Senator, thank you so much for your time. Democratic Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota with us here on Bloomberg. And now we turn to Wall Street, with Tesla reporting after the bell today, surpassing estimates and moving the stock up just about 4% in after-hours trading. For the details, we turn now to a special edition of Power Moves with Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow, who's joining us live from world headquarters in New York. So, Ed, Tesla talking about a demand recovery it's seeing here. How much does this have to do with a hot war in the Middle East that has raised gasoline prices, and people are thinking EVs are a little bit more appetizing?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I don't think there's that much tangible evidence that there's that read-through. The demand picture was a very deliberate choice of language, and that they are seeing recovery in those specific markets is interesting. The stock is trading largely higher because of the positive free cash flow figure. They posted $1.4 billion in positive free cash flow when investors thought they would basically burn through cash and have a burn of almost $2 billion. There's some technicality to that. Tesla had guided to $20 billion capital expenditures for the full fiscal year, which, take my word for it, is a lot for them. But in the quarter, they only had capex of about $2.5 billion. That's half the run rate that you'd expect for that $20 billion figure through the year. I'd really frame this as the no surprises, no shockers print. You know, we're going to learn a lot more on the call. We always do. There's always the Elon Musk wildcard element. But all of those bigger picture projects, they were fleshed out a little bit. There's a plan in production for production of the Cybercab, of the Optimus humanoid robot. It's spelled out in black and white. And really, they were aided a little bit by FX, aided a little bit by lower component and materials costs. And very curiously, they talked about one-time benefits to the bottom line in both the automotive and energy business from tariffs. But they didn't really explain it. So maybe we'll hear a bit more about that too.
Hey, Ed, who cares how many cars we're buying from Tesla if the future is robo-taxi?
Yeah, it's kind of a sort of eat your hat moment, because we spent the whole preview of this saying, look past the core EV business, even the core energy business. We only care about the future. What they're saying is limited. The robo-taxi service, which is still a mixed fleet of unsupervised and supervised cars, has expanded in Austin, Dallas, and Houston, Texas, but they didn't actually give any specific detail on that. Cybercab, which is the purpose-built robo-taxi, is on track for full serial production in 2026. But there's no detail on deployment. The last thing I'd say is FSD, which is the full self-driving consumer-facing subscription, only modestly rose from about 1.1 million at the end of last year to 1.28 million. And so the question, quite fairly, is why is the take rate on that so slow? If the stepping stone to get to robo-taxi is a consumer product where a consumer car can drive itself, why do only 10% of Tesla owners around the world actually pay for it? And they'll continue to get that on the call too.
Well, I was going to say, Ed, that call starts in 15 minutes. Would that be the number one question you'd ask of executives?
The number one question I'd ask of executives is, you have a lot of big plans. You haven't factored many of them into your capital expenditures guide. For example, Terafab, the mass-scale chip manufacturing plan that Elon Musk has across Tesla, SpaceX, and xAI. When are you actually going to start spending that money and factoring it from Tesla's perspective into CapEx? I think a lot of people would pose that too.
Ed, thank you so much, as always. In the clutch, Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow. You can catch Ed every morning alongside Caroline Hyde. Bloomberg Tech, 11 a.m. Eastern, right here on Bloomberg TV. Coming up, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent testifying on Capitol Hill today, sharing that many U.S. allies have requested foreign exchange swap lines. We'll get details coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Many of our Gulf allies have requested swap lines. You would have just read about the UAE, and swap lines, whether it's from the Federal Reserve or the Treasury, are to maintain order in the dollar funding markets and to prevent the sale of the U.S. assets in a disorderly way.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Keely Lyons. And that was Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on Capitol Hill today, signaling to lawmakers that U.S. allies are looking for backstops as market stress builds amid the conflict with Iran. Bessent was one of several top officials testifying before congressional committees today, including Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick and U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. For more, we're joined by Jonathan Tamari of Bloomberg Government and Bloomberg Treasury reporter Daniel Flatley. So, Dan, to start with you, these are supposed to be about the budgets for their departments. And as is usually the case with these things, it largely turns into these cabinet secretaries having to defend the policies of the president. So did we learn anything new from especially Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent regarding the economic ramifications of this war in Iran or the other policies that Trump has pursued?
Yeah, it's interesting. Besant was asked about this report about the UAE requesting a swap line or being in discussions with a swap line, which is essentially financial support from the U.S. To the Emirates. And he let slip that actually there have been numerous requests from countries in the region and in Asia for this type of arrangement. If you recall, back in September-October timeframe, there was a swap line that the Treasury established with Argentina. Yeah. And so it seems like some other economic partners and allies of the United States are interested in a similar potentially type of arrangement. But it also kind of sends a signal that, hey, if this conflict is going to continue for much longer, we're going to need some economic support, or we may at least want to have that option.
Could be a lot of asks coming in a lot of different forms, including, Jonathan, a supplemental budget request, or how about just the annual fiscal year budget, which is why these cabinet officials are up there trying to make the case before appropriators when it comes time to write a budget for the next year. We've talked about a lot of elements of this plan, including the first $1.5 trillion budget in Pentagon history. How well are these officials doing in making the case? Will they get what they're asking for?
Well, they're facing a pretty skeptical audience, to be honest, and it extends. Obviously, Democrats are very skeptical of a huge increase. That's something on the order of 50% of an increase for the military. And that does not, we should note, include the cost of the Iran war, which we understand will be coming as a separate request. But there are some Republicans who've actually been a little bit skeptical early on. Now, they always say, watch how they vote, not necessarily what they say in these hearings. But there are some Republicans who say, listen, we're spending a lot of money. We have a lot of debt. We can't justify a 50% increase. And there's questions about how many Republicans want to vote for a massive military increase or even vote for the war funding, because right now it's kind of Trump's war. They're allowing him to kind of run it. They don't necessarily want to take ownership of this at the moment.
Well, when we consider what the Senate is going to do, whether or not it approves budgets like this, whether or not it approves the nominees of President Trump, it looks like Kevin Warsh, at least, the nominee for Fed chair, is not going to get the confirmation from the Senate for the time being, so long as the investigation into Chairman Powell is ongoing. Chairman Powell has said he's going to stay on until the Warsh confirmation happens. We heard from Kevin Hassett, the chief economic advisor to the president on this. Dan, he agrees with Chairman Powell. I would imagine that his boss isn't necessarily too happy about that.
Yeah, very interesting development. Thanks to our colleague Saleha Mohsen in New York, who is interviewing Hassett, who essentially said that, yes, he agrees, as you mentioned, Kayleigh, that he agrees with the interpretation that Powell has about being able to stay on if Warsh is not confirmed. And Hassett said, I have not discussed this with the president. So obviously
I would
the president,
bet he's about to.
Yes, and as you know, the president has threatened to fire Powell if he stays on past that date. So more to come on this, but yes, that was very interesting to hear that from Hassett today.
What do we think is going to happen with this confirmation vote, and how long will it be before we find out? I know it's not uncommon to have a hearing and then a vote comes days later, but it could be weeks or months, depending on how long this DOJ case lasts, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it all comes down to what Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina wants to do, and he has made it clear that until this investigation is wrapped up or pulled back or resolved somehow, that he will not budge. What that actually looks like in practice, whether he will vote no in the committee or simply abstain from voting, some of those things we don't have a good sense of yet, but I think that what's most likely to happen is that he will oppose Warsh's nomination in the committee in some way, and then it will have to, be resolved in some way that we don't know yet. So.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. And Jonathan, Bloomberg's Dan Flatley and Bloomberg Government's Jonathan Tamari. We appreciate the insights, as always. Looks like we've got some breaking news on the terminal here, Kayleigh.
More airline breaking news, Joe. American Air reportedly is exploring a revenue-sharing agreement with Alaska Air. Apparently, talks between these two airlines actually included the notion of a potential merger, but that apparently, according to our reporting, did not gain traction. So instead, I guess these talks include adding Alaska to existing partnerships. Of course, this is after the news of the potential United American tie-up. A lot of cold water thrown on by the administration. The United CEO told our Lisa Abramowitz today that he wasn't ready to comment on that.
Stocks aren't moving much after hours, but we'll be watching them. We'll turn to Capitol Hill. Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas up next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. President Trump may have indefinitely extended the ceasefire with Iran, but the Strait of Hormuz remains in contention, with Iran firing on multiple commercial ships today as the U.S. maintains its naval blockade. Joining me now for more on the state of play is Becca Wasser, defense lead for Bloomberg Economics. So, Becca, for a ceasefire, we certainly are seeing a lot of what seems like pretty kinetic activity.
Yeah, there's a lot of action going on in the Strait of Hormuz at the moment. We've got the U.S. blockade, but we also have Iran firing on ships as well. And it's worth noting that a shooting war was one of the worst case scenarios in the Strait of Hormuz at the beginning of the war. And while we haven't seen the U.S. and Iran fire on each other, we are starting to see things get a little bit hot in the waterway, and that's going to definitely color what comes next in this conflict.
Well, speaking of hot in the waterway, we saw reporting from the Washington Post today about a number of mines that Iran may have laid in the Strait and the time it could take to clear them. We're talking months here. Becca, does that seem realistic to you?
6 months. And part of this is the United States divested of mine clearing capabilities years and years ago. So right now they have littoral combat ships that are outfitted in minesweeper roles. They're potentially using some underwater drones to help identify where those mines are. But part of the issue is the U.S. isn't totally sure where they are, and we're unsure whether, Iran also knows based on how they emplace the mines.
Speaking of not being totally sure about things, obviously Central Command continues to post about the number of ships that have been turned away, but we've also seen reports of ships that have been able to evade the blockade, have gotten through. What do the figures actually look like to our understanding, Becca?
So as far as we're aware, we've had Lloyd's List say that about 26 ships have managed to get through the blockade. We've also had Vortexa say that about 34 ships have gotten through. And Central Command says, though, that the blockade has 100% enforcement and that 29 ships have been diverted or have been essentially disabled. On April 19th, the United States fired upon an Iranian ship, commercial cargo ship, to try and poke a hole through its engine room in order to make sure that it didn't make a run on the blockade line.
Okay, so clearly there is some difficulty in making sure that the ships that they don't want to get through do not. And of course, Iran wants to make sure that many ships can't get through as well, hence the firing on the vessels, sometimes the seizing of them. When we consider Iran's capabilities at this point, Becca, when we consistently hear from President Trump that we have degraded their navy, that we have degraded so much of their armed forces and their power, Iran is still able to pull this off. So what is it that the U.S. may need to target if they want to put a stop to it?
Right now, there's Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles that haven't been significantly degraded. There's IRGC fast boats. There's still potentially mines, as well as other forms of conventional missiles and drones. We've barely seen Iran bring enough capability to play in the Strait of Hormuz. And if, this turned into a shooting war again, I think we'd see a very, very contested waterway.
Okay, so when we consider that, then, knowing that a ceasefire is in place for now, is Iran capable of reconstituting a lot of these capabilities in this interim period? If this is an indefinite ceasefire, couldn't they just stall the negotiations in order to replenish themselves and get reorganized? I just wonder if this risks backfiring from a military perspective as they the U.S. tries to pursue this diplomatic off-ramp.
Yeah, playing for time would definitely benefit Iran, but there's only so much it can do in the interim. Right now, it's trying to dig out some of the buried missiles and missile launchers, and that's going to allow them to at least bolster some of its stockpiles. It can also look to Russia, for example, to see if it can obtain shipments of, additional upgraded drones, some of the Shahed drones that Russia has actually been able to use to great effect as well. So there are things that Iran can do, but trying to do that in such a short amount of time is really difficult. And if you're really thinking about military reconstitution, we're talking months, if not years. And that's also the position that Israel and the United States find themselves in.
Indeed it is. All right, Becca Wasser, great stuff, as always, our defense lead for Bloomberg Economics. Joe.
All right, Kaylee, thank you so much. Joining us now live from Capitol Hill is Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas. As promised, he serves on the Senate Budget, Finance, and Agriculture Committees. And Senator, it's great to have you back with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'd like to start with the matter of Iran, and there are a few issues that we'd love to spend some time with you on here. The Washington Post, as you may have heard, is reporting that it could take 6 months to fully clear the Strait of Hormuz. This based on a Pentagon briefing to Congress, knowing now that Iran is reportedly mining or has mined the Strait. Well, we've got gasoline at $4 a gallon, diesel with a 5 handle. How long can farmers in your state put up with this? Is 6 months too much?
Well, look, President Trump's going to announce this week some help with the fertilizer issue as well. And still today, diesel prices, gasoline prices less than they were for a significant amount of time under Joe Biden. But I am concerned. I want the gas prices to come down. I know there's a group of people out there that are hurting, and we're working on the cost of housing, of health care, of child care, all those types of things. But look, this is hurting Iran much more than it's hurting us. I mean, we're basically embargoing their entire country. They can't even feed themselves right now. So if they have no income, no food, hopefully this war will come to a much of an end. Remember this, though, if Iran had nukes, if they had nuclear weapons, then gasoline would be $10 a gallon. And that strait would be blocked off for years as well. And not to mention just the safety of Americans going forward for generations to come. Think about, you know, if North Korea had nukes along with the income of Iran, what they would look like. So, look, we need to stay the course here.
Well, when we consider staying the course, Senator, and you mentioned the nuclear threat from Iran, as well as obviously the Strait of Hormuz, what is your degree of confidence that a diplomatic resolution to this conflict is going to yield a guarantee that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, a guarantee that they will never again reclose the Strait of Hormuz, when Iran, at every opportunity, frankly, is countering President Trump's suggestions that they will?
Well, look, what we know for sure is under the previous Obama agreement that Iran would for sure have had nukes by 2030, maybe even sooner. I think it's a year-to-year thing, and sometimes it's whack-a-mole. But I think by us controlling the airway, by us destroying their missiles, by us destroying their Navy, we can go in there, and if we have to come back, we will. There's no guarantees, and this is why it's so hard to predict and negotiate with an irrational, emotional theocracy. They're just impossible to deal with. You're getting mixed messages out of Iran right now because they are having a challenge. They don't know who's controlling Iran right now, but we have the upper hand. And I think that's what's important to remember. We have our foot on their neck right now, and we need to keep it right there.
Yeah. Is their Navy destroyed, though, Senator? We keep hearing about the threat from gunboats. They're laying mines. Obviously, there still seems to be a threat in the Strait that we have not eliminated. Why does the president keep saying that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that there are some small gunboats out there. I think it's fair to say we destroyed 90% of their Navy, maybe more like 95%. This last 5% may be more difficult, but we're going to address that. But remember, we've embargoed them, that we put up this blockade to blockade them from getting any money as well. So I think we're winning this. You know, this analogy I've been thinking about all day. If today's national media were covering the war at Gettysburg after day one, we would have quit. Is the price worth it or not? Sometimes freedom is not free, and it is time for American patriots to stand up. For 47 years, Iran has been killing Americans and threatening us, acting the bully part right now. We have our foot on their neck. It's time to finish the job for the sake of future generations. We cannot have an Iran with nuclear weapons.
Do you have an estimated price tag as to what exactly finishing the job will cost? Senator, obviously there is still not a supplemental budget request that has been made to your colleagues on top of the $1.5 trillion defense budget that the president has already asked for. How high is this tally going to go for American taxpayers?
Yeah, I don't have a number for that. But what I do know is if we allow Iran to get nuclear. If we allow Iran to get nuclear weapons, though, gasoline is going to go up to $10 a gallon. I think it's all a guesstimate. Is this war going to last a day? Is it going to last a week? You all make it seem so simplistic. Again, look who we're dealing with right now. These folks, they have no respect for life at all. They treat children and women like animals. It's very difficult to tell. I'm sure it's going to be $50 billion, $100 billion. It's a lot of money. But I still think at the end of the day, keeping Iran from having nuclear weapons is our top priority here.
Yeah, we're actually interested in the complexities of this whole standoff, to be honest with you, Senator. It was the president who said 2 to 3 days, then 4 to 6 weeks, and now it appears to be indefinite. I know that you're still waiting for a supplemental budget request on that, and we'd love to speak with you when we get there. But I'd like to ask you about some other matters as well, because it appears that potentially even by the end of this day, if not tomorrow, the administration is going to reclassify or reschedule cannabis. Now, of course, we don't only call you Senator, we call you Dr. Marshall, and I know that that's something that you have great issues with. Have you tried to counsel the president against making this move?
Oh, not personally, and I'm not sure. I've sent some messages to the White House and had some discussions with folks there, but I'll be disappointed and concerned about it as well. I think cannabis is a gateway drug. It does lead to mental health issues as well. It leads to just lots of challenges for folks. It decreases their purpose in life. They seem to lose any type of drive as well. So I'm very concerned about it, and I'll be disappointed.
Speaking of things of your concern right now, especially this evening, Senator, when it comes to the budget reconciliation effort moving forward, obviously there has been some concern from your colleagues, the likes of, for example, John Kennedy, about this potentially being kind of the last train to leave the station before the midterms and Republicans needing to seize on other opportunity besides just funding ICE and CBP. When all is said and done, is this going to be the narrow, skinny bill that the majority leader initially promised, not just when it leaves the Senate, but once the House is through with this?
Yeah, I'm afraid it has to be that way. Look, I've been calling since we passed our working family tax cuts bill, which, by the way, is leading to a record number of Americans getting a nice large tax refund this year. But I've been calling for this bigger bill since then. But right now, time is of the essence, that we're going to run out of money to fund DHS, and we've got to get this passed sooner than later. And I'm going to be out there pushing and fighting for a bigger reconciliation bill. Whether we can get that done before the November election, time will tell, but I think there's a lot we can do to work on to bring down the cost of health care, the cost of child care, housing. There are lots of things that I do want to work on. On the same token, we have bipartisan opportunities. Our transparency, our price tags bill, forcing every health care provider to show you the price of something before you have health care done will bring down the price of health care more than anything setting out there. That should be done on a bipartisan basis. So I think there's bipartisan opportunities, but if the Democrats refuse to do anything on a bipartisan basis, then let's do this third reconciliation bill as well.
Well, with reconciliation at hand here, Senator, do you expect a Vote-A-Rama tomorrow night? What can you tell us about the process? I'm just about out of time, but is tomorrow an all-nighter?
Yeah, it may be even tonight. I hear that folks are interested in starting it tonight. So whatever it takes to get this reconciliation budget across the finish line, the sooner we can start paying everybody at DHS, and then move on to other matters like bringing down the cost of health care, the cost of housing, and the cost of child care. So it may be tonight. We'll get some coffee brewing here soon.
Oh, boy.
All right, Republican Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas. Enjoy your coffee, sir, and thank you so much for joining us live from Capitol Hill. And we do have some sad news from Capitol Hill tonight as well, as it was announced earlier today that long-time Democratic Congressman David Scott of Georgia has died. Scott, a 12-term lawmaker, made history during his tenure as the first ever black chair of the House Agriculture Committee. He was set to run for a 13th term in his state's Democratic primary just 2 weeks from now. Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens responded to the news of Scott's death in a statement that called the lawmaker a, quote, tireless advocate for the people he served. Congressman Scott was 80 years old. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons. In tonight's Power Brief, the Trump administration is nearing a rescue package for Spirit Airlines that could give the U.S. government the option to own as much as 90% of it. The deal, which has not yet been finalized, would provide as much as $500 million in financing in exchange for warrants to purchase up to 90% of the carrier, according to people familiar with the matter. Shares of Spirit, no surprise, closed higher today, surging more than 450% over the last 2 days.
Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. continuing a marathon of hearings on Capitol Hill this week, with 2 more today. Republican Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, who delivered a key vote for Kennedy's confirmation, pressed the secretary over whether President Trump's new pick to lead the CDC will have the independence to make decisions that might differ from political appointees in order to not undermine trust in vaccines. The secretary said the next CDC director will be allowed to operate independently.
And voters in Virginia narrowly passed a referendum on Tuesday that could help Democrats in their quest to gain back control of the House of Representatives this November. The measure, which will allow for the redrawing of the state's congressional districts by the Democratic-led legislature, passed with 51% of the vote. With the new map, Democrats are favored to secure as many as 10 of the state's 11 House seats, with as many as 4 Republican lawmakers potentially losing their seats. President Trump's call for redrawn maps in Republican states like Texas in an effort to keep control of the House is what led national Democrats to pursue their own redistricting push. And joining us now for more on that story and others is our political panel. Roger Fisk, Democratic strategist and former aide to President Obama, is with us, alongside Republican analyst Aaron McGuire, strategist at Axiom Strategies. Welcome to you both. Roger is the Democrat. I'm sure you are eager to take a victory lap on this. However, I'm going to go to the Republican first. How much remorse do you think there is in the party right now for getting in on this gerrymandering business in the first place, given how the tally now looks, which is it actually works out to favor Democrats ultimately?
Yeah, I was never a big fan of the gerrymandering process. I was never a big fan of trying to blow up a process that equalizes the opportunity for representation in this country. And Republicans kind of dropped the ball here, and we've seen it. Not only did they not play the long game well on this, but in Virginia, to have such a close vote and to have seen as many mailers as I did at my door, but not the volume of ads and not the volume of voter contact that would persuade voters in the way to get them engaged on such a close vote, less than the margin that Kamala won the state by. You should have seen more effort put in by national Republicans to say, we don't want to see just one vote. And to Virginia voters' credits, they saw this. They saw this for what this was, that it was a naked partisan play. But there's still enough animosity in the state, especially in the strong blue holds up in the northern part, that they flipped. Republicans have really dropped the ball on this. And now reap what you sow.
Well, interesting. I'm not going to miss the spam text messages.
Yeah, you haven't missed Hey, it's Caroline, and the vote is in 2 hours.
Oh, my God. I've seen Barack Obama more times a day than when he was president. But you say that Republicans dropped the ball. Let's remember, Republicans put the ball in play in Texas. Then it was Gavin Newsom in California. And it looks like in the end here, Roger, this could just be a wash, maybe a 1-seat advantage for one party or the other. So this entire thing was a waste of time?
Well, given that we're losing House members like once a day right now, and for one reason or another, I mean, who knows how this is all going to flesh out. There could be Speaker Hakeem Jeffries before the show is over at the rate we're going right now.
We got 6 minutes.
No, but I agree with her analysis, which is this is not how I would like things to go. I'm a big fan of having a set of rules and then everyone competing by them. But yeah, the president, it's not the first time that he has been impulsive, and you can extrapolate this into an international situation that most of your program has been about so far, with essentially just like an intention, not to say a policy or a goal or a strategic framework, but just a strong kind of impulsive desire. And that's, I think, the genesis of this redistricting thing. It probably looked like something that was going to be pretty easy, and didn't expect the pushback that they got. But yeah, I think it'll be low single digits. I think when it all washes out, 3, maybe 2.
Well, a lot of that will depend on the course of action that Florida chooses. Aaron, what would you be advising Governor DeSantis at this point?
I think Florida's a solid red state. I think that the work that the governor has done and the Florida GOP did over the last 5 years to make that state more Republican, to increase voter registration, to increase propensity of voters in that state, I don't see the need for redistricting. Republicans win competitive seats in that state. Democrats continue in Florida to put up bad candidates. How many times are we going to see Charlie Crist run for something in that state before he decides that voters in Florida don't like him?
Wow.
But facts are facts here, but we can, I mean, that's the thing. Florida's a good state. We don't need to redistrict to pick up seats in that state. It is in a good place. I remain of the mindset we do not need to redistrict. And in New York, Kathy Hochul isn't just necessarily looking at congressional districts. She's looking at judicial districts as well in that state, something absolutely nobody is asking for. But if you are not a person that sits within the major metropolitan areas of the state of New York, outside of the boroughs and Manhattan, if you're looking at Syracuse, Utica, Rochester, Buffalo, Albany, you could be looking at judicial districts that only take care of the large cities and leave the rest of the rural Republican voting population without equal representation, as New York puts it, in the name and the cause of more equitable diversity on the bench, not for any other reason than pure politics. It's invasive now across the country, and that's a massive problem across the board, judiciary, elected officials, otherwise.
Well, as the ground shifts beneath our feet with these issues we're talking about, it's shifting in the timeline when it comes to Iran. Now, the Washington Post, we were just talking about this with both senators. Washington Post says it's going to take 6 months, even if the war ends today, after the war is finished, to clear the Strait of Hormuz. What else is going to be happening in about 6 months' time? Voters will be making decisions in the midterms. We could still have gas at $4 a gallon, diesel at $5, and all the rest of this, Roger. How did Democrats channel that to their benefit?
Yeah, I mean, well, they
or
have
just stay out of the way.
There's an element of that, which is when your opponent is digging themselves a hole, don't remove the shovel. But at the same time, you know, I think Democrats have made the mistake a couple times where they've expected and somewhat banked on strategically the idea that the president's stumbles or weaknesses or whatever one might want to call them are going to deliver victory for them. And I think that the times that the Democrats have overestimated that dynamic, I think, are multiple. And like I've said over and over, whoever's running for office needs to start with a blank piece of paper and say exactly who they are and what they want to do. They can't base a candidacy on their opponents' potential stumbles or anything else. But I go back to where Iran will be in 6 months, and I go back to Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, which I recommend to everyone. And in it, he says, every day that the invading force doesn't win, they lose. And every day that the indigenous force doesn't lose, they win. So, and you can see the obvious logic of that. I mean, the upward climb, 6 months to demine the straits, that pushes. If you think that the gas price impact is going to last another 6 months, that pushes that an additional 6 months on into next spring, et cetera. So I think this is going to continue to metastasize.
Of course, the White House continues to argue that it's all worth it in the name of not having a nuclear Iran. Here's National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett to Bloomberg earlier.
Steve Witkoff, Jared were negotiating with the Iranians on their nuclear program, and started getting very chilling threats about how quickly the Iranians were going to have 11 nuclear bombs, is what they told them. And the president made the judgment that a nuclear Iran can happen.
We have less than a minute left, Aaron, but if this is about things that don't end up happening, does the American electorate give you the credit for the things you stop?
Well, they do, because nuclear proliferation in Iran is a hard line that everybody should be behind. They should not have the opportunity to terrorize the world. And that, if that is the ultimate goal here, as the White House has laid it out, that they believed that that was the imminent threat, then that is something the American people should celebrate, because that is a global success. All of the work that goes into that, including opening the Strait, the administration will have to take flack for. But no nuclear proliferation in Iran is a complete success.
Great conversation with our great panel. Thank you both. Aaron McGuire, Roger Fisk with us live. With breaking news that just hit the terminal, Kaylee, this is a red headline. CapEx at Tesla now above $25 billion. They had seen over 20, just another brick in the CapEx wall.
Yep, coming from the call. Shares turning back the other direction in the after hours. There'll be more coverage of that tomorrow and our political stories right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.